My spirit is in the dance.
Okay, I hope everyone enjoyed that very leisurely break we took, and
Yeah.
we're gonna step back into the yield bill.
Yes.
Julia, do you want to join us? So we're basically, I asked Julia to essentially follow up almost exactly on the conversation we had last week, where we talked about examples, and we talked, we had a conversation maybe on Thursday or Friday when Julia wasn't here, where we talked about the choice points and looked at the columns, but wanted to sort of bring more clarity to that conversation. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. So there's 3 documents on the committee page under my name. One is the Education Fund Outlook from last week. So no changes to that Ed Fund Outlook. It's the one that we've looked at for the last few times that we've been together. There are also 2 other slide decks under my name. One is following up to the conversation that we had about what the yield bill is, what are all of those decision points, high level, that we're thinking about. So it's essentially putting the words I spoke onto a couple of slides. And that's really to help maybe center the conversation around what are those high level decision points that need to be made in order for me to be able to do my modeling. And then the other slide deck that's on the committee page under my name is following up to the interest that some committee members expressed in terms of understanding examples of property tax calculations and average bill changes. So where would you like me to begin, Madam Chair?
Let's begin with the examples, and then we can talk through the scenarios again. Does that make sense to you?
I think so.
Okay, great.
So this is the first slide deck. There's a lot of slides in here. I didn't know the extent to how deeply I'd be walking through it. So I think walk through relatively high level and happy to go into the details where it's fit. So reminder, we're nonpartisan, unbiased fiscal analysis for legislative consideration, not policy recommendations. That is our role. And so I've separated this into sort of 2 buckets, a review of just how district tax rates are calculated and how they vary depending on a district's per pupil spending, and then sort of the scale of average bill changes and some examples for that. So I want to lead with a few like really big caveats that everything I'm doing in this presentation is fictional and it's solely for illustrative purposes. Sorry. And I'm really stressing that because I don't want people to see, oh, that's not my district, or that's not realistic. And it's really to provide some sense of scale. The examples don't include income sensitivity. It's really focused on homestead, but at the end of the presentation, I did do some data, averages and analysis of income sensitivity to help provide some scale. And because our income sensitivity is also adjusted per pupil spending, the directionality and scale of our income sensitized property taxpayers follows that of a homestead. And I'm assuming that all districts in this example, that their CLAs are the same as the state average, to keep things simple, because this is not a presentation on the CLA. So calculating district rates. First, we want to just sort of take a step back and think about the local piece that varies by district. And we're talking about for homestead property tax rates. We calculated district spending per pupil by dividing its education spending by its long-term weighted average daily membership, its weighted pupil count. And so I've put together 3 districts here, A, B, and C, illustrative, not real districts. But I use them as sort of a way to try to get at a lower spending district, a higher spending district, and a district with an average tax rate if we were to follow the December 1st letter permutations. So District A, they've got an ed spending of 10 million, 1,000 long-term weighted ADM. So that would give them an ed spending of 10,000 per pupil. District B, they've got the same long-term weighted ADM, but they have a larger education spending, so they're going to have a larger per pupil spending amount. District C has the same education spending as District B, but has fewer weighted pupils. So that means that they could have fewer students actually in the classroom, or perhaps their students don't fall into some of those same weighting categories as District B. So because they have fewer weighted students, they have a higher per pupil spending. So it's sort of 3 ways of thinking about calculating per pupil spending by district. These are District A and our District C. This doesn't correspond directly with the per pupil spending range that we're looking at that underlines all of the education fund outlooks and yield build, but it's in the same ballpark. So we've calculated the district's per pupil spending. And then we need to calculate those districts' equalized tax rates. So we do that by we take their per pupil spending that we just calculated and we divide it by the property yield. And that's how we determine their equalized tax rate. So this is where that yield becomes so important because it's a factor across all homestead tax rates. So for this example, again, an assumption, I'm assuming the yield is 8,224. I'm using that as an example. It's in one of the columns and I chose it because it follows all of the December 1 letter parameters. It's not a policy choice that's been made. I just had to pick a yield. So that's a yield I chose for this analysis. So what we see here is we see all of the per pupil spending by district and we divide by the same property yield. And so we have our 3 different equalized tax rates, homestead tax rates of the district, right? Equalized because that's before CLA adjustments. Not so coincidentally, District B has the same average tax rate that you see on the Ed Fund Outlook in the column with that yield. So then we would apply the CLA, the local CLA, if it were to differ. For this example, I just said we're going to assume that every district has the same statewide average CLA, but I've included the equation there in case folks wanted to do their own permutations or calculations. That's where you would plug in your local CLA into the denominator. We'll recall that the yield is also being adjusted by the statewide CLA, so that's how the 2 cancel out. But here, because the local CLA and the state CLA are the same, the district tax rate is not going to change. So that's a really quick walkthrough of how we're doing. That's what's going on behind the scenes and all of the calculations that I'm doing for presenting different Ed Fund Outlook scenarios to all of you. We're calculating all of those district tax rates based on per pupil spending. So moving forward, average bill change examples. So I was asked, it would be helpful to see what an average bill change actually looks like. So I took one step further and again, this was a decision, not necessarily what is going to happen. That all depends on policy choices, but I said, okay, we're hearing a lot about 5.8%. The December 1st letter had 5.9%. Let's examine what a 5.8% average bill increase would look like. And I do want to emphasize that this should all be interpreted with significant caution because it is very much an average. So we're looking at the same districts A, B, and C, and what those average bill changes would look like in those districts. So first, looking at District A, this is our below average per pupil spending district. Got up here a little table where we've got our homestead value, 200 to 800,000. And you'll recall that the tax rate is applied on the value of the home, every $100 of value. So essentially what we do is if we were to calculate the FY26 bill, if we're applying this rate, we would take the homestead value, divide it by 100, apply the rate, and that would get us the FY26 tax bill, assuming no income sensitivity. So in this example, I've just shown some scale of what a 5.8% increase would look like across these different homestead values if there were no income sensitivity. We then did the same arithmetic for an average spending district or District B. And again, you can see that because they have slightly higher tax rates, again, they're going to have higher increases year over year. And third, our above average per pupil spending district, District C, and you see that the higher the tax rate, the higher the per pupil spending, the higher the increase is going to be for homesteads in that district. We're looking at here homesteads that are not income sensitized. And income sensitized homesteads would also see a proportional increase in their bills, right? Because the property tax credit is based off of the per pupil spending decisions in that district, along with a number of other factors. But just because a homestead is income sensitized, they are still impacted by the per pupil spending of their district. So, and then I did one for non-homestead. We've got an equalized uniform non-homestead rate across the state. So I took the same non-homestead rate that would correspond with a 5.8% increase and the yield that I've used for these examples. And just to show here what an example increase would look like for 5.8%.
Yes. Has anyone ever thought about, I think about what Representative Holcomb talks about a lot. Has anyone ever thought about having the homestead to non-homestead be relational within communities so that you?
Why do the homestead and non-homestead rates sometimes above each other and sometimes below each other?
Yes, but I get why that they are.
Oh,
But I'm wondering whether anyone has ever thought, why don't we make them relational within a community? Ratio within a community, so I mean, so that you don't end up with incentives that might not. The incentives, the unintended consequences. Do you see what I'm saying?
can you explain why that would be impossible under our current system?
So under current law, the homestead tax rate is a function of per pupil spending and the yield. And the non-homestead tax rate is a uniform rate across the state. So if you were to pursue a policy choice where the non-homestead and homestead rate were to be somehow proportionally aligned within a community, you would then need to deviate from either a uniform non-homestead rate or deviate from a per pupil impacted homestead rate.
Okay, so taking that to what if we were to deviate from a uniform non-homestead rate? What do you think that?
So
would
under
be?
Act 60, before Act 68, that's how it was structured. The non-homestead rate changed from district to district based on per pupil spending. And the proposal that we have for us under the Education Transformation Bill also has a uniform rate, not differences between homestead and non-homestead. And then we have we're working on language right now to break up the non-homestead rate so that you could have deviation even within that. So there are a lot of options and other things have been tried. I don't think any of them are possible within the yield bill this
No,
session.
I just thought, suddenly I thought, wait a minute,
Yes.
what if?
And I think we can explore the what if next week after we
Okay.
pass the yield bill.
All right.
Yes.
I think, to clarify, I think probably what I thought Carol meant was if you said the non-homestead rate is always 10% more, or then you fixed one and then
Within each
you,
community.
right, I thought that's
Yeah,
what you were
I'm
trying to
wondering
say.
if you would say, okay, this is your community's homestead.
Right,
Now, the non-homestead will be X,
some relation to.
a relationship to
Other one
that,
that's fixed.
right? A fixed relationship, but a relationship within each town so that your rates are different from town to town. I don't know what that would be.
I think that would be really interesting. I think that the bill that we looked at, I think just once, bill language from Kirby about property categorization sets them up as a ratio to each other. So I think that would have exactly the impact that you're describing.
Can't remember how it looks.
We'll look at it again next week,
All right.
or you can look at it from wherever it is inside the internet, but I'm not sure where, to be honest with you, because I don't remember what day we looked at it, and it's doesn't have a bill number, so it's impossible for me to find things that way. But yes, it's in there, and someone can find it and send it to
Yeah,
you.
wait till next week to speak about it.
I know I think we're all excited about big changes and we need to pass a yield bill this week.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm also excited about big changes. Yes,
More than being excited about big changes, I hope we have the big picture of what we're doing. And I just would point out that part of what you're seeing there is we often forget that tax policy is dynamic because people respond behaviorally to the things that we do. And if you're in a community where property values have gone up 150% in 2 or 3 years, it is going to have, and this is what's happening to the tax rate, you're also going to drive accelerating drops in student numbers because you can't live in those towns anymore if you're a young family. And so I hope we also can talk about the changes in the context of the larger incentives and the challenge around the floating non-homestead is you also drive all the business out of the state too, certainly on the Vermont border. Is the risk.
Yeah.
And so what they did is
Your
they
problem.
stabilized it so that businesses could play. It's a tough thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was thinking about your problem of your homestead rates being higher than your non-homes.
I'm gonna say it's not my problem.
It's not
our problem. Because when people.
that I learned about from you, which I did not know.
But when the president of a large company in New York rips down a homestead and builds a second
Yes.
home that pays a lower tax rate,
Yes.
it's actually Vermont's problem.
Yeah, I said it wrong.
Yeah.
Just
Representative, yes.
real quick to, I think the example that I have is Jay Vermont. Okay.
Yeah.
Their residential rate is a lot higher than the non-residential rate.
Mhm.
And I've had a lot of people screaming at me that why should I pay for my house? But a condo in Jay is,
Right.
a lot less.
Yes.
And do you mean the homestead and non-homestead rate?
I'm sorry, yeah.
No, it's fine. I just want to make sure.
Similar rate, I mean, referred to as residential rate or non-residential rate.
Also, the non-homestead rate, someone could be living there and say an apartment, so they're residing, but it's the non-homestead rate. That's okay, no, nothing to apologize for. I just want to make sure, because anyway, in the other bill, we'll talk about residential and not residential, so I'm trying to. Anyway. Okay, so we have this one example of what happens when we increase a non-homestead.
Yeah.
Do we have more examples of how this works? Is this helpful? Are these scenarios helpful? to
Yes.
people? Okay, great. Okay.
May I say one thing about the conversation that you just had? I know that we're moving on, but I would be remiss if I didn't also add that in communities where where the homestead rate may be lower than the non-homestead or maybe higher than the non-homestead rate, it's also important to consider the property tax credit and income sensitivity, right? So just because the homestead rate is higher does not necessarily mean that the average bill in that homestead bill in that community is higher because of income sensitivity.
Except that their property values have gone up 150%, there are literally no houses worth 400 or less anymore. So you're paying over anyway.
Yes, I'm not trying to make any sort of case. I'm solely reminding that,
Yeah.
because we're going into the, property tax credit, the reminder that in fact, within the yield bill, we're looking at three components, the homestead, non-homestead, and income sensitivity. Which leads to the final couple of slides that I put together. This one should look really familiar. I pulled it from a presentation that I did for all of you, I don't know when, I guess a couple weeks ago. This is looking at for fiscal year 2025, the number of filers receiving or eligible for a property tax credit in these different groups. So again, we've got our household income groups here on the side. They've been broken out in correspondence with the way that the tax department has presented modeling. I do want to note that the bins are not uniform across household income group. And same goes for the equalized household group. Again, those bins are also not uniform. But what we see is essentially the way to read this is that the household income group of 0 to 25,000 in household income and 0 to 100,000 of house site value. There's about 2,100 households who exist within those parameters in fiscal year 2025. And then I also have included here, this is a new slide for all of you, what their average liability was in fiscal year 2025. Important to note that this is if the property tax credit earned in fiscal year 2025 were to be applied for fiscal year 2025, right? So this is not reflecting the taxpayer's experience, but rather reflecting their actual liability in FY 2025. But I've included this here to give you another sense of scale in terms of when we're talking about percentages increases and decreases, and before we were just looking at homestead bill changes. This is what your average liability or average bill in FY 25 is estimated across these different groups. And lastly, just a reminder that we're talking about averages here. So they're varying widely, as you were all speaking about, across district and also across taxpayer. And so it's important to keep in mind that average is a helpful metric, but it's not reflecting the diversity of the experience across Vermont. And I've also included a final slide with a lot of other resources. Originally, I was just going to send an email to the committee with all of these resources. And then when I realized I'd be doing the notes or these notes, I've included them here for all of you to check out. There's some spreadsheets and there's some great resources from the Department of Taxes.
Thanks, Julia.
Yeah.
So what we started to do last week is we sort of got really sort of linear and explicit about decision points. And then we looked at columns to match them. And I want to sort of engage in that activity again with Julia here, guiding the sort of tour of the Outlook. So let's try to do that together. Do you want to pull up the Outlook unless you have?
It's unchanged from last week.
We have a presentation.
Yes. I'm happy to, it just automatically came up to this. I'm happy to.
Let's do that. Let's do that. And then we can look at the Outlook.
Okay. So it's like 3 slides,
Yep.
2 slides, if you don't count our JFO nonpartisan disclaimer. I've already given that.
We've got that.
So a reminder of really big picture yield bill policy choices. What are we talking about? We're talking about how to raise funds for the education fund, right? We account for all of the uses in the education fund and all of the non-property tax revenue streams. And then whatever is left over is what needs to be made up somehow. And it's the yield bill that's determining how we're making that up. Those funds can be raised through other revenue sources, property taxes, homestead, non-homestead, all a policy choice. And so I put together on a slide the list of questions that I spelled out for all of you. or we spoke about, it was not just me, last week. It's not an exhaustive list, and perhaps I've consolidated some questions into one, but I think it's a helpful starting point in terms of thinking about your non-property tax revenue sources. You know, how much do you want to use in surplus? How much do you want to take from the general fund? How do you want to raise that property tax revenue, homestead, non-homestead? Should the average bill change be the same? Should it be different? What about income sensitivity? How are we setting the property tax credit? Do you want to reserve funds for future fiscal years?
So I wonder if folks, I know lots of people are following this on their own devices, so I wonder if we could keep this slide on our own devices and then all look at the yield at the outlook on the big screen. Does that make sense?
I'll look up here.
Yes. Oh, it is so extra small.
Bigger there than there.
Lovely, thank you.
Same March 11th.
Yes, it's the exact same set of columns we looked at last week. Okay, so if we think about that first question of using one-time money, meaning a general fund transfer to bring down rates. What does that look like? Yes,
Could I also ask the reverse question
Sure.
of what it would look like if we just to know took nothing from the general fund? Is that on here?
Do you want me to just?
just in the column, yeah. thank you.
D.
That is detailed.
And I will note that column D does assume all of the education fund surplus of 41 million is used uniformly. And column D is what we were just those examples, the yield
Based on, okay.
and the rate was pulled from column D.
Thank you.
Did the agency of education ever provide the data that was requested? Things like big drivers of cost, how much Medicaid is used in special ed, all of those questions that were asked last week. Did we ever get that data?
No, but I also did not respond to a follow-up email about it yet. And it's possible that JFO has received something and I just don't know.
I'm not sure the data
Okay.
that's being referenced.
Yes.
Is my understanding to Betty's question, if that $77 million wasn't in there, that's where that 5.9% increase would be coming from, right?
Yeah.
Right, it would have to happen. Is that?
Yeah, without the gen,
I'm sorry.
without the 77. Yeah.
Unless they cut some, or unless one of the other committees cut something.
Right, okay.
So that's one thing we don't have on here. So if one of the, can you scroll down to like rows? Ish?
Let's do.
Bless you. If we moved,
Better.
transportation aid into the transportation fund. I'm not proposing we do that under any circumstances, everyone. I just want to be very clear about
They
that.
can hear it through this.
Yeah, right.
And they will come for us. They're already mad.
Yeah,
Madam Chair, again, just looking at the big picture, and again, I haven't looked at this that close, but am I correct in assuming, or at least this is what my perspective would be on a policy decision? To keep things as uniform as possible currently, simply because in the next 2 years, we're gonna go to a foundation formula with maybe one tax rate. So I guess that's the perspective that I'm coming from, at least at this point, to not mess around too much with everything else. Does that make sense? I mean, that's.
Sure. I mean,
I'm certainly
yes.
open-
Yeah.
I'm certainly open to everything, all the discussion, but
Mhm.
that's just my initial feeling about what we're gonna be putting people through in the next couple of years.
So what I hear you saying is to keep the homestead and the non-homestead average bill change the same.
Yes.
Okay, and
With the $77 million.
with the general fund transfer.
Right.
Okay, so that would be column E?
Correct.
Okay. So one thing that is really important for us to remember is when we have a one-time transfer like that, we wind up with a hole the following year, right?
Big.
And a $77 million hole, what we've seen in the last few years is that we are having less surplus revenue year over year. And so we might not have an extra 77 million to put towards it next year. What will that look like
Plus the 25 million last year.
from last year? Yes, that's one of the holes we are climbing out of. Yeah. Yeah.
Just ask, where did that 41 million that's down on the chart, where did that come from?
So the 41 million that you see here in line 40,
Yeah.
the prior year unreserved unallocated, essentially what that means is that the current estimate is with the closure of FY 2025, that revenues will be 41 million higher than anticipated, and or appropriations will be adjusted in the BAA. So this is still carrying the past BAA, which does have a decrease in the education payment compared to what was closed at 25. So essentially what it means is that appropriations are lower through the BAA in FY 25 and or, and the answer here is and, revenues are higher.
Okay, so that's not involving the 77 at all.
Correct. So when we're looking at columns D onward, regardless of if there's any general fund money, the assumption is that the full 41 million in education fund surplus has been used to lower property tax rates uniformly.
And is that gonna dig a hole alongside the $77 million hole? So we'll have two holes.
Yeah.
77 and 41.
I mean, we could call it one hole of 110 if we.
Yeah, well, right.
It's nice to think of them that way.
You're so funny.
I feel at this point, since we keep on, done this now, is it's almost as though there's just a general fund transfer every year, and that's what happens for this year. I'm not advocating for or against it, but it seems to be what we're doing. Because I don't think we can, how do you get yourself out of that hole?
Yeah.
Yeah, Emily, do you know how we used to always do a general fund transfer? That happened before you were born.
It's just before.
Do you know how that was figured?
I believe that Julia knows how it was figured.
Yeah, so it was in 2018, there was a
I was born long before 2018.
I don't remember the act number off the top of my head, but essentially the general fund transfer was done away with and the ed fund received all of sales and use tax.
Right.
Yeah, right.
There is, JFO does have a really interesting one-page issue brief that I can send a source citizen around that talks about how the general fund and the education fund sort of fared from that split. The sales and use tax was fully dedicated to the education fund, and then pretty much following that immediately was the Wayfair decision. So sales and use tax increased more than was previously forecasted.
I know you're busy, but if you could send that.
Absolutely.
But there was a formula for what the general fund to transfer was to be, I believe. Right.
Except that various governors fooled around with it.
Yeah, well, maybe so, but by statute, there had been a formula for how
One
much.
person at a time, one person at a time. Okay. You had that was not for you, Jim. You did have your hand up, though. You started speaking. We're good. Yes.
Just to say there was a formula, but during many people's experience, one governor or another would swap it around here and there. one reason why we didn't, we stopped doing that.
More than one governor,
Yeah, so.
to be clear.
Representative Burkhardt.
Okay,
May I ask a question about, I know that this has been a discussion in the past with this governor, and I don't know about previous governors because I didn't follow theirs closely. When governor proposes 77 million should be dedicated to buying down the property tax rate, what's the history on if we decide not to do that or only take a portion of that, of reserving that funding somehow? Because where I'm going with this is, in my mind, school districts passed budgets based on the December 1 letter, for the most part. Not every school district did, but most of them did. Those communities knew roughly what their property tax rates were going to do. And I'm speaking from one where we're going to have a pretty high property tax increase in my community if we don't buy down property tax rates. However, I'm increasingly concerned about what's happening on the federal level and what that might do to the ed fund. And I don't like digging ourselves a hole with a big general fund transfer. At the same time, I don't like that money just disappearing to other uses. If, a whole bunch of federal funding that is right now going into the ed fund, or not into the ed fund, but into education funding in some way in Vermont goes away, I would like to sort of have a little bit of a cushion to sort of blunt the effects of that if possible. But if we say no to the 77 million and just sort of accept this tax rate, does that just disappear? And then we have no cushion anyway, because it goes and gets used for something else.
We have in my limited history in the ways and means when you represent Brennan. My youthful history. I even had a teenager when the general fund transfer went away. Let it go. We have absolutely put transition reserves in place in times such as these. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
For levity, I'll point out that I was born when Act 60 happened, so. Yeah,
Thank you.
That's great.
But just for Representative Burkhardt's point, part of me wants to say that we should just, to me, it's just truing up the ed fund rather than digging a hole or doing a general transfer. The budgets have passed. We know how much Vermonters have approved spending on education. My preference from a policy perspective would be just to pay that money. And we can have broader policy conversations about whether that's too much money or not. Budgets have been passed. All that being said, I think that if we don't do any general fund transfer or a buy down, we're headed for a veto.
It is for a what?
A veto.
A veto.
I'm sorry, one more time?
I'm afraid that if we don't do any buying down of,
Well, I don't know if we know that, right?
Yeah.
And I think we were in a very different policy. I think having the budgets pass was a different thing than where everyone was feeling when the December 1st letter was written and budgets were drafted. I'm not sure, but I think that, I don't want to get us thinking too far down the pike, that we should certainly think about what the experience would be like for taxpayers.
right.
I want to separate our conversation out a little bit. So Representative Higley brought up the consistent homestead, non-homestead average bill change, which is something that we generally do, but have not always done and don't have to do. They can change at different rates. Again, a reminder that the average is just an average, and the average bill change is like something of a mathematical construct that, right? And so that doesn't mean that, it won't be the same in any community necessarily, but it is something that we tend to do. So I'm curious other people's thoughts on that, keeping them consistent versus not. I remember Representative Odie brought up some concerns about that last time we were having this conversation. Do other folks have, yeah.
Also, way back in the dark ages, this committee, when Obuchowski was chair, we fiddled around with homestead versus non-homestead in a way that I thought seemed to be to our advantage, but it wasn't to everybody's advantage. And I certainly would prefer if we could keep things fairly consistent. I think it's fair rather than working on something to our advantage, although we have a little ways to go before we decide that, and I certainly am amenable to using some of the $77 million as we need to. I think at this point in time, early in the game, I'm very much opposed to putting it all in at the start. We've got a lot of things to figure out before we get to that point in time. But
Julia, can you show us the column where the homestead and the non-homestead don't change uniformly?
Yeah, so column F here. And column H, yeah. Do you want me to explain the parameters behind those?
These,
So column F is assuming the 77.2 million in general fund transfer. And buying down the homestead average bill change to 0%. And saying, not using that, any of that 77.2 million to non-homestead. So whatever is left from the 77.2 million, putting it into a transition reserve, 33 million. So that's what we see in column F. And in column H, we say, still, assuming the 77.2 million general fund transfer, but say, okay, we're gonna take the 77.2 million in general fund transfer, save half of it in a transition reserve, use the other half of the 77.2 to uniformly buy down rates this year, or for fiscal year 26, which gets us to 3.5%. And then we're going to do a one-time property tax credit increase of 3.5% and raise that one-time property tax credit increase on the non-homestead rate, which brings us to 4%.
So that one adds a new policy decision to it.
And last year we added 13% or $13 million.
13%. So last year there was a one-time property tax credit increase of 13% for property tax credits that were appearing on FY25 bills. That meant that those credits appearing on FY25 bills were the credits that were earned in FY24. And that's reflected all the way here to the
20 million.
about 30, yeah, 28.
what if we do two things? Keep them consistent. As Mark was saying, and we look at, what if we do? We keep them consistent, as you were saying, Mark. And then, because of what you said, Emily, you know, people pass their bills based on 7% use it also. And let the 77 million maybe drop to the bottom line, is that where you would put it? And then say, okay, now we have the 77 and the 47. 41, and we just wait. We see what happens with the feds.
So if the 41 was not applied to tax rates, what would the tax rates look like then? That's not what people voted on. People voted on the 41.
They would about, I then leave the, well, what would they look like?
I don't have that modeling in front of me, but I could come back. They would be higher. It'd be higher than 5.8.
I think it's good to have people have it come out the way people expect it to, not that anyone really knows. But based on the December 1st letter, and then hold that money aside, the 77 million. And who knows what'll happen between here and that and the Senate and everything else. And also, who knows what'll happen with the feds. And also it would be nice not to get into an even worse situation than we're already in.
Yes.
So you're recommending that we put the full 77 into a reserve?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So that would look like column.
That column doesn't exist on this sheet.
But it would be column.
However, it would be column D. And here you'd see the 77.2 million general fund transfer, and down here you'd see the 77.2 in the transition. So for the outlook itself would be a wash, because you'd be putting it in, but also pulling it back into a reserve. So a 5.8% increase.
Mhm. Representative Feltes.
I would suggest that we keep the rates uniform. Whatever change there is, that it should be uniform between homestead and non-homestead. And I think, I don't really buy the argument that people voted for these budgets based upon the December 1st letter. I mean, yes, they did, but I don't think that means that they did not want some kind of property tax relief, which is certainly what I heard on the campaign trail. And so they're not going to be happy with a 5.8% increase. I would think we need to do something. Even though I hate pulling money from the general fund to put it in here. I think we need to do something in order to reduce the rates. To reduce the expected increase. But to have that, whatever that increase is, to be an equal percentage of both sides. I certainly do not favor making the homestead rate with a greater relief than the non-homestead rate.
Anyone interested in having the non-homestead rate carry more of the tax responsibility than the homestead rate?
I don't think so.
I know it's a risky thing to say, but we're gonna have to be risky.
I know that my constituents would support it.
Well phrased.
However, I know the impact on business and industry and those properties that are rental properties as well. So I'm reluctant to advocate for it. But also feel like you need to have some relief, property tax relief, not just enough to hold it at 5.8. But I'd rather spend just half of it, not all of it, and bank the other half.
Start.
Consistency is my favorite too. I just had the county's only 420 person employer.
Are there 421 person employers?
They decided they were gonna leave the state because of the Paragon, because
I did read about that, I'm sorry.
they're unable to build a new factory or get improvements approved or I mean, it's very sad.
Mhm.
It's a wonderful place to work.
Mhm.
They make baby food.
Mhm.
But they're leaving the state. So we need to do whatever we can, which I think is where Charlie's headed. Provide stability for employers as well as homestead.
And I might feel differently if we really had already passed legislation that had more breakdown of the
Yes.
homestead property tax rate. But in my mind, I have multiple constituents and a lot of them are small business owners or, you know, some of them are larger business owners too, but like they're business owners and they're homestead property owners. And I just can't see burdening the employers and the small businesses even more in the current setup that we have. If it were structured differently, potentially we could have that discussion, I think, but.
Yeah, jumping off of that point, strongly believe that when we have moved towards a system with more breakdown of non-homestead property tax classifications, I believe strongly in having the non-homestead hold more of the property tax burden. That's just not where we are right now. And I'm also giving Barry, we have about 50-50 renters, i.e. non-homestead. And I'm very concerned as to what would happen if the message went out that we're raising non-homestead rates, if that would translate into rent increases for half of my constituents.
Okay, thanks. Anything else on here that folks wanna dive into before we wrap up?
We haven't talked about trying to move something out of the ed fund into some other source.
We have not.
That's where I was gonna go. I'm really strongly against using the 77 million to buy down tax rates, especially when we haven't done anything to bring down cost. And at the end of the day, this is a spending problem. It's not a tax problem, if we see it that way. So I would really like us to consider that. And I know we've all discussed some examples of things that could be done that would bring down that burden, maybe not all the way, but substantially. I also am mindful that we have some pretty significant construction issues and no funding source. Boy, wouldn't that 77 million be a nice start on construction? And if we do know that we have places where high schools just aren't viable, that partnering with a neighbor might be a good thing for kids and communities. We don't have any cash to help them do it right now. So.
I know that the education committee is looking at line items to move out of the ed fund, but I don't think they were anticipating it would be for fiscal year 26.
But there are ones where we already know we have duplicated funding streams where you could do no harm and just take it out of the ed fund.
Could you say what those are?
We now have full-time income sensitized admittedly, but childcare subsidies, full day for kids who are 3 to 5 that people have access to through Act 76. And we also pay for about $14.5–15 million worth of pre-kindergarten in private childcares. And so if you just said anything that's in a private provider is off Act 76, that would be a cent and a half on the tax rate or a cent on the tax rate.
And that's something that I think Human Services and the Education Committee are working on together. Again, they just weren't anticipating it would be for FY26. They were anticipating it to be part of the transformation.
And what it shows is a good faith effort that we also feel like this is our responsibility.
Representative Feltes?
I would just remind us that there has been the suggestion of taking out universal meals at 18 million. Maybe thinks of that. Yes, it's assuming we're going to spend it.
And part of that is that all of the budgets that passed had an assumption that universal school meals was included in them.
Right, I understand.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
It's another one of this bunch here that you might look at to move.
Just in response to Representative Holcomb's suggestion about $77 million would go a long way to school construction. You know, I don't know as though it would. I mean, when you're looking at what they're looking at, $300,000 a year that they want to.
Oh, we got nothing now though. I mean, up in your area, they opened the year in tents. I mean, we got a real problem.
Again, what I worry about that in particular is, you know, similar to, you know, our, can't remember just how much it was, the money for the PCB testing.
Yeah.
And Burlington ate up half of it. I mean, that to me was not fair at all to, you know, like North Country High School, whatever. And I just worry about, there's got to be a whole process with that is, you know, who needs it the most?
Agreed.
And again, if we're going to go into this whole reconfiguration of schools and consolidation, blah, 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 maybe the school that somebody might need the most to put a few $1 million in is going to go by the way of being sold to the town for $1. I mean, I don't know.
I totally agree. I think that's one of the reasons that we included new bonding in the excess spending threshold was because sort of the whole ed fund paying for construction costs that might not be needed in 2 years might not be a good use of the collective dollar. There is a school construction bill that has all those sort of guidelines that you were describing that will, I think, be part of the next step or sort of on this step. You were going to say something.
Well, Marty talked about the universal meals. Well, was the intent to go back to the free and reduced, and what was the cost of that?
18.4 million.
No, that's universal.
Oh.
So the universal meals program, yeah, in all of these scenarios, assume that it's kept in. For FY26 is estimated to be 18.5 million. The removal of the universal meals program does not necessarily correspond with 18.5 million in savings. I know that that was assumed in the GovRec budget, but there are additional costs that were not borne in the GovRec budget of the return to a pricing program, which are those increased administrative costs, as well at which depend on the number of districts that do return to a pricing program. There's also the question of if universal meals is repealed, every school district in the state is going to decide, do they want to return to a pricing program or do they want to continue with universal school meals? Every school district that maintains universal school meals, that cost will still be borne within the education fund. The cost of the pricing program and corresponding student debt will also still be borne within the education fund.
And there would be additional federal funds that would be for it.
Anyway.
Correct.
Okay, I think this was helpful, at least for me to get a sense of where everyone was. I hope it was helpful for everyone else. We are going to pick up this conversation again tomorrow, so try to take a minute to record your thoughts so we can maintain them into whatever conversation we have tomorrow after we talk about 4 other bills with different topics. Thanks, and see y'all at 9 AM.